Elvis was a very special person. He never turned no one down that was in need. He was a loving and caring person for everyone that he came in contact with, and most everyone loved him.
For 26 years after the world lost Elvis Presley, someone was still turning the lights off at Graceland every single night. Not a caretaker, not a security guard, a member of the family, sleeping in a small room just off the kitchen, while millions of strangers walked through the rest of the house during the day without ever knowing she was there. Her name was Delta Mae Biggs, and until she died in 1993, she was the last Presley family member to actually call Graceland home. What she witnessed inside those walls, across decades most fans only know through photographs, was never something she sold, published, or performed for cameras. It simply stayed with her, until it quietly became one of the most human footnotes in the entire Elvis Presley story. Long before she became a strange, almost mythical figure to Graceland tourists, Delta Mae Presley was just Vernon Presley's younger sister. That made her Elvis's aunt, and inside the family, nobody called her Graceland's mysterious resident. She was Aunt Delta, plain and simple, a woman who spent much of her early adult life the way countless people did in the mid-20th century South, married, settled, unremarkable in the best sense of the word. She had a man named Pat Biggs, and for years the two of them lived a life that had nothing to do with recording contracts or sold-out arenas. Her nephew's fame was something that happened in newspapers and on the radio, not something that touched her day-to-day existence in any meaningful way. That changed the way loss tends to change things, slowly, and then all at once. When Pat Biggs died, Delta was left a widow with no children of her own and no particular reason to keep living in the same empty house that now echoed with his absence. So she did something that, inside the Presley family, was almost expected. She went home, not to a childhood house or a hometown, but to Graceland, where her brother Vernon and Elvis had built a household that had room, both literally and emotionally, for family members who needed somewhere to land. It's worth slowing down on how ordinary that decision actually was, at least from the inside. There was no press conference, no magazine spread announcing that Elvis Presley's aunt was moving into his mansion. It was simply a grieving widow moving in with relatives who could take care of her. The same quiet arrangement families have made for each other for generations. The only unusual detail was which family it happened to be. Delta moved into Graceland in 1967, into a household that already included Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae Presley. This was still years before tour buses lined up outside the gates. Graceland in the late 1960s was not yet a landmark. It was a house, admittedly an enormous and eccentric one, where an extended family was trying to hold itself together while one of its own transformed into the most famous entertainer alive. Stop and consider what that actually meant on a day-to-day basis. Delta wasn't a distant cousin who showed up for holidays and left. She was living under the same roof as Elvis Presley through some of the most consequential years of his career. The tail end of Beatlemania reshaping the music industry around him, the grinding years of formulaic Hollywood films, the electric reinvention of his 1968 comeback special, and eventually the long, exhausting stretch of Las Vegas residencies that would define the final chapter of his life. She wasn't reading about any of this in a magazine at the grocery store checkout line. She was hearing the arguments about it over breakfast. Elvis's generosity toward the people who stayed close to him is not a rumor invented after his death to make him look kinder in hindsight. It's one of the most consistently repeated details from nearly everyone who actually spent time around him, from bandmates to bodyguards to family. He kept relatives close. He gave people jobs, homes, and financial security, sometimes to a fault. Delta had a roof over her head. She had family surrounding her, and she had a front-row seat to a life that most people on Earth could only imagine from behind a television screen. But a mansion full of family isn't automatically a peaceful place, no matter how much love exists inside it. The very thing that made Graceland extraordinary, housing a genuine global superstar, also made it a pressure cooker. Everyone inside those walls absorbed some version of the chaos that came bundled with fame at that scale. Fans gathered at the gates and never fully went away. Elvis's schedule swallowed his own time, and by extension, the time and attention he could give the people around him. The pressure didn't stay contained to Elvis alone. It seeped into every room of that house, and everyone living there Delta included, carried some portion of it, whether they had asked for that burden or not. So what happens when a family's private sanctuary starts to feel less like a shelter and more like a stage that never quite goes dark? To understand what Delta actually witnessed, you have to first understand what Graceland really was during those years, because it bears almost no resemblance to the version tourists walk through today. It wasn't a museum. It wasn't curated. It was a lived-in home, occupied by a family trying to function normally under conditions that were anything but normal. Elvis bought the estate in 1957, and importantly, he didn't buy it purely for himself. He bought it as a home for his parents, for his grandmother, and eventually for the extended relatives, Delta among them, who would move in and out of its rooms over the following decades. Graceland was, in that sense, always designed to be a family compound before it was ever designed to be a landmark. Inside those walls, the picture painted by the people who actually lived there is far more layered than the simple, glossy version of Elvis most fans encounter. It isn't the story of an untouchable icon gliding effortlessly through his own mansion. It's closer to a portrait of a man split cleanly down the middle. On one side stood Elvis the family man, the relative who made sure everyone under his roof was fed, housed, and looked after, capable of a warmth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the boy he had been before any of this started. On the other side stood a man increasingly boxed in by the sheer size of his own legend, dealing with isolation, relentless scrutiny, and the exhausting machinery required to keep Elvis Presley running 24 hours a day. Delta lived close enough to see both versions clearly. She wasn't a fan pressed against the gates, trying to catch a glimpse. She was family, sharing meals, sharing hallways, sharing the mundane rhythms of a household that just happened to have a rock and roll icon wandering through it in house slippers. She saw the Elvis who never made it into a magazine spread, tired after a long night, short-tempered over something small, simply human on an unremarkable Tuesday. And she also saw the other Elvis, the one who could still light up an entire room the moment he walked into it, whose charisma didn't switch off just because there weren't any cameras present. That contrast is really the heart of what makes the family history of Graceland so compelling to look back on. It wasn't a house defined by scandal. It was a house defined by tension between opposites, warmth and pressure, generosity and exhaustion, closeness and creeping isolation, sometimes all inside the same afternoon. It's the kind of dynamic plenty of families would recognize on a much smaller scale, except here it was magnified by money, by fame, and by a level of public attention that most households never have to factor into a Tuesday night dinner. And then, on August 16, 1977, that version of the story ended abruptly. Elvis died at Graceland at the age of 42. It remains one of the most exhaustively documented events in modern entertainment history, confirmed by medical examiners and reported around the world within hours. The king was gone, and the house he had built as a refuge for his family would never again function as simply a family home. What happens to a house once the person who made it famous is suddenly, permanently absent? And what happens to the people who are left standing inside it? Elvis's death didn't empty Graceland all at once. It emptied slowly, one loss layered on top of another, and Delta was there to watch nearly all of it happen in real time. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, died just 2 years after his son, in 1979. Minnie Mae, the grandmother who had shared that home with Delta for over a decade, passed away in 1980. One by one, the people who had filled Graceland with noise, arguments, laughter, and the ordinary texture of family life were gone. The bedrooms sat empty. The dinner table grew quieter with each passing year. A mansion that had once buzzed with the chaos of an extended Presley household slowly started to feel like an echo chamber of itself. That left Aunt Delta, alone, inside a mansion originally built around a legend, holding down a home that increasingly felt like it belonged more to the public imagination than to her own family. Every other person who had shared that roof with her over the years was gone, and yet she remained, walking the same hallways, sleeping in the same wing, even as the entire estate began transforming into something else entirely around her. In 1982, Priscilla Presley made the decision to open Graceland to the public. It was, in many respects, an inevitable move, a preservation decision as much as a business one. Elvis Presley's home was too culturally and financially significant to sit closed up and slowly decaying, while the estate debated what to do with it long-term. On opening day, thousands of fans lined up outside a home that, until recently, had been entirely private. But turning Graceland into a public attraction also meant something strange and deeply personal for the one family member still living inside it. Delta's actual home, her bedroom, her kitchen, the ordinary texture of her daily life, was about to become part of a tourist itinerary, and she had no intention of leaving. So an arrangement was reached. Delta kept her bedroom, tucked just off the kitchen, positioned away from the route tourists would walk through the mansion. That room, along with the kitchen surrounding it, stayed off limits to visitors for years, deliberately carved out so Delta could continue living exactly the way she always had, undisturbed, even while thousands of strangers moved through the rest of the house every single day. Which raises a question that probably never occurred to most of the tourists filing past the velvet ropes. While they photographed the living room and marveled at the jungle room, what exactly was happening just a few feet away, behind a door none of them were allowed to open? This is the point where Delta Biggs stops being a footnote in someone else's biography and starts becoming genuinely fascinating in her own right. By day, Graceland operated like clockwork. Tour groups moved through the mansion on a tight schedule, guided past the famous white staircase, the dining room, the piano room, everything curated for maximum reverence toward the man who had once lived there. And somewhere behind a closed door near the kitchen, an older woman with a small dog lived her actual, unglamorous, ordinary life, mere feet away from the spectacle unfolding around her. According to accounts shared by the family over the years, including recollections from Elvis's daughter Lisa Marie Presley, Delta had a sharp, entirely unfiltered sense of humor about her strange living situation. She wasn't always thrilled to be treated like the resident ghost of her own home, and when curious tourists occasionally spotted her walking her dog and asked if she happened to be Aunt Delta, she reportedly had no patience for playing along. Family retellings describe her simply telling strangers that Delta had died the night before, then continuing on her walk as if nothing had happened. It's less a scandalous headline and more a small, sharp glimpse into a woman who had grown tired of functioning as a living exhibit inside her own house. There's something almost comic about that image once it sinks in. Somewhere inside America's most visited private residence, a woman in her 60s was walking her dog past strangers who half-treated her as part of the attraction, and her chosen response was to quietly mess with them rather than perform the role they expected. It's a small detail, but tells you a great deal about who Delta actually was underneath the last resident of Graceland label: sharp-witted, more than a little stubborn, and not remotely interested in playing a character for an audience she never asked for. At night, once the final tour group filed out and the front doors were locked, something interesting happened. Delta would emerge from her room and have the entire mansion to herself, uninterrupted, for the first time all day. According to accounts from people close to Graceland's archival operations, she would sometimes rearrange small elements of the house. During those quiet hours, subtle acts of ownership over a space that legally belonged to an estate but had once simply been hers. This apparently extended even into conversations about how the home's decor from Elvis's final years should be preserved, a small but telling reminder that Delta didn't experience Graceland purely as a museum piece. She still saw it, at least partly, as a home worth having an opinion about. Sit with that contrast for a moment. During daylight hours, Graceland functioned as a shrine to a deceased icon, roped off, narrated, and photographed by thousands of visitors a day. After dark, it quietly reverted to being somebody's actual home, with somebody still deciding where the furniture belonged. So which version was the real Graceland? The polished museum thousands of strangers walked through every afternoon, or the after-hours house that only one woman still understood how to live inside? Here's where a lot of the more sensationalized retellings of Delta's story start to stretch well past the truth. Search around and you'll find versions claiming Delta exposed some hidden scandal about Elvis, some long-buried secret, some cover-up finally dragged into the light. The reality is both less explosive and, honestly, far more interesting than that. Delta's real legacy was never a bombshell revelation. It was a first-hand, decades-long perspective on what it genuinely looked like to be related to Elvis Presley, while the rest of the world was busy turning him into myth. She didn't need to expose some hidden crime, because the truth she carried around with her for over 2 decades was simpler and more human than that. Elvis was generous with the people he loved. He kept his family close even as fame pulled him further and further from anything resembling a normal existence. And the relentless pressure of being Elvis Presley around the clock took a visible toll, not just on him, but on the people orbiting closest to him, Delta included. That's not a small thing to carry, even if it never made a headline. It's arguably the harder story to tell, precisely because it doesn't collapse neatly into a single clickbait sentence. It's the story of a family trying to preserve something resembling ordinary life inside a house the entire world wanted a piece of. It's the story of a woman who buried her husband, moved into her nephew's mansion for stability and companionship, and ended up spending the rest of her life as the last living bridge between Graceland the home and Graceland the landmark. That's likely why Delta's story has grown more appreciated with time rather than less. In an era where nearly every celebrity anecdote gets stretched into a conspiracy or inflated into a scandal for clicks, her memories point in the opposite direction entirely. They serve as a reminder that fame doesn't actually erase ordinary life underneath it. It just makes the ordinary moments much harder to see from the outside. Behind Graceland's gates were family dinners, quiet conversations, daily routines, the occasional disagreement, real laughter, and long stretches where absolutely nothing dramatic happened at all. Those stretches rarely make it into documentaries because they don't generate headlines, but they're often the most revealing part of any story, precisely because they're the truest. Delta also represented something increasingly rare inside Elvis's world as the years went on. Someone whose relationship with him predated the records, the screaming crowds, and the Hollywood contracts entirely. She had known the Presley family before they became American royalty. That gave her a genuinely unique vantage point on Elvis, one that had nothing to do with preserving a brand or defending a carefully managed public image. She simply remembered the nephew she had watched grow, gradually and then explosively, into a global phenomenon. In many ways, her quiet recollections are a reminder that history isn't preserved only through formal interviews and newspaper archives. Sometimes it's preserved through the people who stayed in the background, watching everything unfold from the next room over. It's worth pausing on how genuinely rare that vantage point actually is. Almost everyone who has ever written or spoken publicly about Elvis Presley is working from the outside looking in. Biographers piecing together old interviews, fans reconstructing moments from grainy concert footage, historians combing through decades-old newspaper clippings. Delta needed none of that second-hand reconstruction. She simply lived there for decades, through the highs of his career, through the death of the man who made the house world famous, and through its slow transformation into one of the most visited private homes in the entire country. Her perspective wasn't borrowed or reconstructed. It was lived, quite literally, day after day, inside those same 4 walls. When Delta passed away in 1993, something shifted almost immediately. Her bedroom, the one space tourists had never once been permitted to see, was restored to reflect how it had looked when Elvis's parents originally lived there, and the kitchen itself was finally folded into the public tour the following year. The last real barrier separating home from museum quietly dissolved the same year Delta did, almost as though the house itself had been waiting for her to finish living in it before it could fully complete its transformation into something else. There's a strange kind of poetry buried in that timing. For the 26 years Delta lived there, one small, private corner of Graceland remained exactly what it had always been underneath everything else, somebody's actual home. The moment that finally changed was the same moment Delta was no longer there to occupy it. So, was there ever really a secret worth exposing? Or was the real secret simply this: that underneath the legend, underneath the gates, the gift shop, and the endlessly guided tours, Graceland was, for a very long time, still just somebody's house? Delta Biggs never wrote a tell-all memoir. She never sat for some blockbuster interview promising to spill Elvis's darkest secrets to the highest bidder. What she left behind instead was something quieter, and in a lot of ways, far more honest. Proof that even inside the most famous house in America, someone was still just trying to live an ordinary life, one day at a time. Maybe that's the actual truth Graceland's last resident leaves behind. Not a scandal. A reminder that behind every legend, there's still a family, still a home, and still someone left turning off the lights at night. Millions of people have walked through Graceland's front doors since it opened to the public in 1982. They've stood in the jungle room, stared up at the gold records lining the hallway, and paused quietly in the meditation garden where Elvis rests beside his parents and grandmother. Almost none of them ever knew that for 11 of those years, someone was still actually living there, just a few feet away from the velvet ropes, quietly finishing out an entire life inside a house the rest of the world had already turned into a monument. That's the part of this story that tends to get lost in the noise. Not a scandal, not a buried secret, just a woman named Delta, who buried her husband, moved in with family, watched a nephew transform into a legend, watched that same nephew die far too young, and then quietly held on to the last unclaimed corner of his childhood home until there was nothing left to hold on to. It's worth asking why a story this quiet, a story with no scandal at its center, has managed to stick around in the public imagination decades later. Part of the answer is simple curiosity. People are fascinated by the idea of someone living, actually living, inside a house that the rest of the world only knows as a museum. There's something almost dreamlike about the image. Velvet ropes and gift shop lanyards on one side of a door, an ordinary bedroom and a woman's evening routine on the other. But the deeper answer has to do with what Delta represents in the larger Elvis Presley mythology. Most of what the public knows about Elvis comes filtered through performance, whether that's a concert stage, a movie screen, a magazine cover, or a carefully managed publicity photo. Even the intimate details fans think they know tend to arrive secondhand, shaped by biographers, historians, or former associates looking to sell a story. Delta never needed to shape anything. She wasn't managing an image or protecting a brand. She was simply present for decades, in the unremarkable in-between moments that never made it onto film. That unfiltered proximity is exactly what makes her perspective valuable, even though she never turned it into a book deal or a paid interview. In a media landscape that constantly rewards exaggeration, where every anecdote about a dead celebrity risks getting sharpened into something more scandalous than it actually was, Delta's quiet, consistent account of life inside Graceland stands out precisely because it refuses to sensationalize anything. She wasn't interested in being famous for having known someone famous. She was interested in living her life, which, as it turned out, happened to unfold inside one of the most recognizable buildings in America. There's also something worth noting about the timing of when Delta's presence became widely known at all. For years, casual visitors to Graceland had no idea that a family member was still living there behind a closed door near the kitchen. It wasn't hidden out of shame or secrecy in any dramatic sense. It was simply private, the same way any family might keep a grieving relative's living arrangements out of public conversation. The fact that her presence eventually became part of Graceland's own lore says less about any deliberate reveal and more about how stories like hers tend to surface naturally over time, passed along by tour guides, family members, and longtime employees who found her both endearing and a little bit legendary in her own right. Graceland's archivists and the Presley family themselves have, over the years, folded Delta's story into the broader narrative of the estate almost as a grace note rather than a headline. She's mentioned in official retrospectives not as a source of hidden drama, but as a symbol of continuity, the living thread that connected the Graceland of the 1950s and 60s, when it was simply a family home, to the Graceland that exists today as a monument visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. Without her, that thread would have been severed the moment Elvis died. Instead, it stretched on for another 16 years, quietly, in a bedroom just off the kitchen. It's also worth remembering that Delta's story isn't really about Elvis Presley the icon at all, not in the way most stories about him are. It's about what happens to the people left standing after fame has already done its work. Vernon Presley, Minnie May, and eventually Delta herself all lived out their final years inside a house whose meaning had already shifted permanently, from private residence to public landmark, long before any of them were ready for that shift to happen. Delta simply outlasted the others, and in doing so, became the last person who could say, honestly, that Graceland was still her home and not merely her nephew's memorial. There's a certain dignity in that kind of endurance, staying rooted in a place even as its purpose transforms entirely around you. Delta didn't get to keep Graceland as it once was. She adapted instead, carving out a small, unbothered corner of a house that had become one of the most photographed buildings on the planet, and she held onto that corner until the very end. When she died in 1993, Graceland lost more than just its last full-time resident. It lost its final living connection to a time when the mansion was simply a house where a family ate dinner together, argued over small things, and went to sleep at night without a single stranger walking past their bedroom door. That connection can never really be replaced, which is exactly why Delta Biggs, a woman who never sought fame, never gave a tell-all interview, and never tried to profit from her nephew's legacy, remains one of the quietest and most genuinely human footnotes in the entire story of Elvis Presley. Not because she exposed anything shocking, but because she simply refused to stop living an ordinary life inside an extraordinary house for as long as she possibly could.